Well, hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Greg Poland, professor of medicine and infectious diseases at the Mayo Clinic, founder of the Mayo Vaccine Research Group, and editor-in-chief of the journal Vaccine. I'm pleased to bring to you today a COVID vaccine update addressing vaccine hesitancy. And I am joined by a very special guest, my daughter, who is a mental health counselor and trauma specialist, Caroline Poland. So welcome, Caroline.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Well, I am going to start with making a few background comments, and then I'm going to turn it over to Caroline to make some comments. And our plan is to have a discussion. As every one of you listening to this understands, it's one thing to have really almost nothing short of the miracle of COVID vaccines within a year. It is a completely different issue in regards to use of those vaccines. Now, this is not new or novel with coronavirus. In fact, I published a review article in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2011 on the history of the anti-vaccinationists. We see this with every vaccine. I think the media has played it up more given the fire of a pandemic, but it has been a problem ever since we've had vaccines. So what does that look like in the US right now? Well, for vaccine eligible individuals, we have some 30 to, in some areas, 40 to 50% of the population who has not been immunized. And many have called the current pandemic at this point a pandemic of the unvaccinated. That's not quite fair because there are breakthrough cases, et cetera. But it is very clear that where we see hospitalization, severe disease, mechanical ventilation, death, and severe complications, that is almost exclusively seen in people who are unimmunized. And there are a lot of reasons for that and common misconceptions. So Caroline, having briefly described that, how is this playing out in a pandemic from the way that a mental health professional thinks about this and attempts to guide individuals? I know this has been a prominent part of your practice, in fact, so maybe you could comment on that.
So I'd like to frame my comments with this idea that we're going to take a deeper dive into curiosity. And the reality is that humans are whole people. And so when we're talking about vaccine hesitancy and addressing that, we really want whole person. So I'd like to frame my comments through looking at the head, the heart, and the body. Now, the reality is that we continue to live in a global psychological trauma, and we have been living that way for close to 2 years now. And think of a trauma as anything that impacts our felt sense of safety. And that impact then impacts the body, it impacts the nervous system, and therefore it impacts decision-making. The reality is that anytime we have any perception of any potential threat, that can kick us out of our prefrontal cortex and we lose access to that good and wise executive function, and we kick into fight or flight responses. Now, we all have a neurobiological drive for survival, but survival will be defined differently by different people. So some of that foundation as we begin to address conversations is to understand the impacts of trauma, the impacts of that on our nervous system, and what living in fight or flight means for that individual and for decision making, and how that individual defines survival.
So Caroline, one of the things, I know you've done a lot of work in this area, both professionally in your practice and in your writing, is this whole notion of stepping back for us as healthcare providers and professionals to think about what's happening nervous system wise that plays out in what we see, namely in this case, vaccine hesitancy. Can you kind of briefly give us a background on that?
Absolutely. And I think that fits really nicely into this framework of doing a deep dive into curiosity. I think one of the primary things that we as healthcare providers need to do is to enter conversations with curiosity as we begin to talk to our patient, to understand what's the story that they're living in, what are the narratives that they're telling themselves, and to begin to understand how their life and what they have gone through has impacted their nervous system. And one of the questions that I like to be aware of when I'm sitting across from someone is that individual and is their decision-making coming out of that sympathetic nervous system or that parasympathetic nervous system? Are they bringing wise executive function to that situation, or are they living out of that fight or flight, fear-based, survival-based part of their nervous system?
Yeah, that I definitely see that. People come in, and when you really get to why have they not taken a vaccine or a COVID vaccine, as you talk with them, you find out more often than not, it is fear-based. Now, Caroline, I'm going to ask you to expound a bit on a statement that I've heard you say in your talks, and I've carried into the exam room, and that is how we listen and for what purpose. Could you just make that statement and comment on that?
Sure. So this comes from Stephen Covey, this idea that in order to have good and healthy communication, we need to listen to understand instead of listening to reply. And that isn't always taught within our professional training. And if we listen with the intention of just replying back, we might listen to what's actually kind of happening on the surface, but we miss the deeper story. When we sit back and put our reply to the side and really listen to understand, how does my patient go about decision making? Who do they view as their trusted sources? What are the roots of their fears and their concerns? So that I can understand that first before replying. Now we can get to the root of their decision-making process instead of saying at the surface level.
And this is not a 5-minute conversation.
No, and it might not be a one-time conversation. And I think, again, that's why I kind of frame this through this deep dive of curiosity. Of course, we want to be able to have that quick conversation and move our patient, whether we're talking about vaccine hesitancy or any other number of areas of health decision-making. We want to be able to get them from point A to point B in a minute, that appointment. The reality is that this is potentially a long journey with some of our patients, and how we show up as we journey alongside them will have an impact on where they fall then on that vaccine hesitancy spectrum.
Yeah, that's excellent. In fact, in our medical literature, there's ample evidence that says when we have a hesitant patient or a rejecting patient, to just hammer them with take the vaccine is actually counterproductive. And I think it's a mistake that we've made. So I want to use the background you've now sketched out for us, Caroline, and have you talk about ways to address vaccine hesitancy. And in particular, I'm going to ask you to talk about 2 tools that you've developed. One, the model of preferred cognitive styles and decision-making, and the second, the empathy tool, which is really some cool work.
Sure. So let's start with the preferred cognitive styles and decision-making model. And this was published in the journal Vaccine in 2011. And a couple bullet points just to lay the foundation of this model. A cognitive style is just a basic thinking style. It's simply a lens that impacts how any individual perceives and processes information, particularly under conditions of uncertainty or where they're not perceiving that there's a lot of control. A global pandemic certainly fits in that category. So each individual has a preferred cognitive style that they employ when they make decisions, and how they take in and process information then informs their decision making. So this model really guides healthcare providers in having a good and productive conversation using the language and strategies that are most meaningful to patients. Now, the reality is that health information tends to be presented in a very analytical way. We focus on the data and the facts. That's how we as healthcare providers are professionalized. That's how data, say about the COVID vaccine as an example, is presented. And not all individuals process information in the analytical style. So the reality is that if we continue to just speak in this analytical style and present information that way, we're actually missing a big group of our patients in presenting information in the way that works for them.
So, Caroline, this is really important because this is how you and I started working together professionally when you made the statement to me at the dinner table one night that said, Dad, I think you guys have it backwards. You use your cognitive style to explain to people what they ought to do who are employing a different cognitive style. And you made this statement that stuck with me. Our job is to understand the preferred cognitive style of the patient we're privileged to treat and change our style to match or meet their needs and their style. Did I get that right?
Yes. It's a big paradigm shift at one level because we, as healthcare providers, we understand it's not about us when we walk into the exam room, and yet how we engage in conversation and how we present information is, in essence, about us. And so the paradigm shift is it's not about us. It's not about what we prefer. It's about what the patient prefers or where they're at in their decision-making journey, where their nervous system is at, where their past history is at. And then we journey alongside them. That's the body piece of this framework. It's the side-by-side journeying together at the pace that matches the patient in the way that they communicate and process.
And I think this is profound. I think this is the route we need to go in dealing with vaccine hesitancy. What we've been doing is the definition of insanity. Mm-hmm. With each new vaccine that comes out, we do the same thing, expecting different results and never getting them. So what I like about this is that it's evidence-based. You've developed the model. You've tested it among internal medicine residents. Now let's move to a second tool that you and a specialist in human-centered design just published, and you call it the empathy tool. Tell us about how to use that for conversations about vaccines.
So the empathy tool was published late winter or early spring this year, also in the journal Vaccine. So this empathy tool we designed with the idea that it meets the patient's needs. It's not simply about the provider's needs. So this is a tool that healthcare providers can use that was specifically designed to aid the healthcare provider in understanding the variety of influences and their impact on the patient's decision-making process. So we acknowledge that not only do these influences exist, but also they're constantly evolving in nature, and the healthcare provider can really gain a unique and nuanced window into the patient's decision-making rationale. So this is broken down into a spectrum. And again, we publish this with Vaccine Hesitancy, but you can adapt this in your practice to any healthcare decision that a patient might need to make. And on one end is for vaccine, one end is against vaccine. And of course, there's a lot of shades of gray for individuals in between those two ends. So then we look at who are the influences or the trusted others that are impacting this decision. And we look at the strength of how impactful those influences are, and then how the patient feels about those influences. So whether this is a family member or politics or a religious institution or any number of factors that we're looking at, how do you feel about this influence? And so we're able to use this simple tool to engage in a conversation so that the patient can walk away feeling like I was understood and I was heard. And that immediately starts to build trust. And trust is then impacts our felt experience of safety when we're in the exam room, when we're safe.
Key connection. Yeah,
absolutely. And when we're safe, we move into that prefrontal cortex and we have, access to that good and wise decision-making again.
Well, Caroline, this to me is a new paradigm, and I think a way that we'd really encourage healthcare providers to adapt. Can you just summarize, give us those three, head, heart, and one sentence of what each of those are in terms of an overarching meta-narrative around vaccine hesitancy?
Yeah. So again, this framework is just a deep dive into curiosity about the patient in their health decision-making. We have the head. So we're going to identify the patient's cognitive style and then communicate to them in that style. Then we move down to our heart. We're going to listen to understand our patients instead of listening to reply to them. And in doing so, we're going to seek to understand their values, their fears, their concerns, and their influences. And then we're going to get into our bodies. We're going to journey alongside our patients in that decision-making process, understanding that this isn't a one-time conversation. And we're going to do this in a trauma-informed way so that we can understand not only the impacts of trauma on the body, but on decision-making as a whole. And by engaging our head and our heart and our body as we sit with our patients, we're giving them the dignity and respect of being whole people and bringing their whole selves into this decision-making process.
Wonderful, wonderful stuff. Caroline, thank you. For our listeners, we'll put the information up so that you can access the papers that Caroline has talked about. So with that, I want to end our time together. I hope you will try some of these techniques and this method of thinking in addressing vaccine hesitancy, because I think at this point in the pandemic, we have no other options. We have safe and effective vaccines and people who fundamentally are afraid to use them. We need to acknowledge that and address that with this paradigm of head, heart, and body. I hope this has been helpful to you. We look forward to further discussions. Thank you all.